morning and good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome to another episode of Philosophical Conversations with Thomas Jefferson, a part of the Real Thomas Jefferson Show. And the aim of this show is to get better acquainted with Thomas Jefferson as a philosopher, and through that, perhaps to get better acquainted with ourselves. I'm your host, George Gorey, formerly a captain with the California Highway Patrol and currently a criminal investigator with the local district attorney's office in the San Francisco Bay Area in California. Dr. Holochuk is a professor of philosophy and history who taught at institutions such as the University of Pittsburgh, the University of Michigan, and Rutgers University Camden. He is author, editor of over 70 books and nearly 400 published essays, formal and informal, on topics such as ethics, ancient philosophy, science, psychoanalysis, and critical thinking. His current research is on Thomas Jefferson, and he is acknowledged by many scholars to be the world's foremost authority. And he's published over 300 essays, formal and informal, and has 30 books on Thomas Jefferson. He also writes about Ukraine. Today, we will be discussing our review of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation website, especially as it relates to the topic of slavery and the Sally Hemings controversy. Good morning, afternoon, Colonel. How are you?
I'm fine here. I'm at Monticello in the early spring, and I'm bringing up the webpage so we can have a look at that. And as you talked about, we're going to look at some aspects of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's webpage. I'll state, as you access it, when you go to monticello.org, you get some beautiful pictures coming up, and you look on the top, you can buy tickets. There's a calendar of events, there's a thing for educator. You can donate money, you can shop. There are books you can buy. Of course, none of my books are for sale. They're never even mentioned. I find it funny when you look at the Thomas Jefferson, they look at, we're going to focus on Jefferson and Sally Hemings, what they state. A statement by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, June 6, 2018. This is when the then president issued the statement that Thomas Jefferson definitely fathered all of Sally Hemings' children. They're going to treat it as fact. They're going to remove the qualifiers. There are no qualifiers. And when you remove the qualifiers, you don't have to, you can pay lip service to, you don't have to pay special attention to any arguments against their story, against their case. So, I thought you and I would just sort of take a look at this. I'll read through, we're going to read through their 10 arguments. The funny thing is that later, in this account here, they're talking about why remove the qualifiers. Let's start with that. As the Thomas Jefferson Foundation began planning the life of Sally Hemings, an exhibit that relies on the account left by her son, Madison Hemings, it became apparent that it was time to re-examine how to characterize Jefferson's paternity. For nearly 20 years, the most complete summary of evidence has remained a report authored by the Foundation in January 2000. This is a report, I've looked at before, that comes out. It looks at all the evidence, at least they claim it looks at all the evidence, a very biased look at the evidence, as we'll see. And while there are some who disagree, there are many, the Foundation's scholarly advisors and the larger community of academic historians who specialize in early American history has concurred for many years that the evidence is sufficiently strong to state that Thomas Jefferson fathered at least. Now, I've been arguing against this absolute travesty, this bullshit, that the evidence is sufficiently strong. I had a friend of mine ask me, do most scholars, early American scholars, is there a consensus among historians? And I'll say, yeah, there is. And, my friend sort of blushed and thought, well, geez, that sort of seals the deal. I said, no, it doesn't. It's not a matter of what most historians think. It's why they think the way they think. What's the evidence? I said, I frankly don't care what most historians think. I want to look at the evidence. What does the evidence tell us? In fact, most scholars believe in the story because they're afraid to disagree with Annette Gordon Reed, who's Black. And if you do that, you're a racist. Right? It just, I've been called that before because I disagree with her. I don't disagree with her because of her skin color. I disagree with her because her account is bullshit. All right, so Captain, you and I are just going to look at, for someone, for removing the qualifiers, in other words, treating this as fact, there ought to be something in the evidence that just pulls you by the hair and forces you to agree that Jefferson fathered all the kids. So what is
It
it?
must be self-evident, right?
There's nothing that I can see. You want to read the first one?
Yeah, Madison Hemings, this is number one, provided an account of his mother's life that was published in an Ohio newspaper in 1873. The basic outline of Madison Hemings' account, including his mother's quote unquote treaty with Jefferson and the freedom granted to him and his siblings, was well known to his community before it was published. His narrative is the most important extant evidence, and much of the corroborating evidence supports the outline of his narrative.
All right, so what are we supposed to say about this? This was published in 1873. I've talked to this ad nauseum. You and I will have to do a show on this. We talked about Israel Jefferson's testimony, which came out months after Madison's testimony in 1873. And in effect, what we showed is that Israel's testimony was not additional corroboration of the, it was just drawn from Madison. It's basically saying, well, Madison is my friend, and I agree with what he said, and as much as I agree with anything about which I can't be certain. So Israel's testimony does nothing. Of course, they use it as additional confirmatory evidence. So Madison's testimony, I've argued elsewhere, is massively flawed in many accounts. And he speaks of his mother's treaty with Jefferson. Sally came over, and she was 14 at the time when she arrived. She was 16 when she left. So at some point, he fell in love with her. What I found interesting, and I find fairly decisive, is that Abigail Adams, twice in letters, when Sally came on the ship and was accompanied his daughter, Mary, Abigail said the woman with her, the girl with her, wants more care than the child.
Yeah,
So
she's
she's
immature.
14. And if she wants more care than the child who's 8, she's behaving at a behavioral pattern under 8 years of age. So Jefferson's going to see that. He's going to see some 14-year-old, pretty young girl at 14, fall in love, have to have her, and even though she behaves like she's about 6 years old. That's not what Jefferson wanted in women. That's not what he sought. I mean, you have anything to say?
Well, I mean, if you look at France, I mean, it's very his relationship with Maria Causeway. That was the type of woman that he fell in love with, an educated, artistic woman, one who could engage in conversation. And when you look at his character and you look at his relationships with women, even his friendship with Abigail Adams, a smart, fiery, intelligent woman, I just don't see how a man of his intellectual stature would be. You would find a 14-year-old girl who's going on 8 as appealing. I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't see that as, when you look at someone's character, you look at their intellectual character and emotional character. I just don't see that in him.
Yeah. I mean, they will even concede that we don't know if she was literate, and probably she was illiterate. So Jefferson would have found that a big, massive, massive turnoff. And again, the whole thing is that Gordon Reed says the case for paternity is dependent on Madison Hemings, the veracity of Madison Hemings' account. Right? I've used that in the past. It said it's very simple reasoning here. If there are flaws to the account, then the whole case for Sally Hemings being fathered, or Jefferson fathering Sally Hemings killed, falls apart. Okay, there are flaws in the testimony that things should fall apart, and yet they persist on their webpage. And I'm going to hold Jane Kaminsky, the current president, accountable for inheriting this mess, but not doing anything to open up discussion on it. All right, let's go to number 2. You want to read that again there, Captain?
Yeah. Number two is Foster et al. Parentheses 1998 DNA study revealed that the male line descendants of Eston, a son of Sally Hemings, and male line descendants of Field Jefferson's father, who was Thomas Jefferson's grandfather, shared the same Y chromosome haplotype. This demonstrates that Eston's father was a Jefferson male. This result not only corroborates Madison's account in the Pike County Republican, it definitively refutes the claims by Jefferson's grandchildren, including Ellen Randolph Coolidge and her brother Thomas Jefferson Randolph, that either Peter or Samuel Carr, and they could not agree on this one, was the father of Sally Hemings' children.
Okay, so where do we go with this? I mean, you want to comment on this?
I mean, you look at this right here. I mean, it says a male line descendant, right, of Field Jefferson. I mean, there's 25 Jeffersons in that community at the time, including his brother Randolph, Randolph's sons. There was cousins. I think he had a cousin, George Jefferson, who visited Monticello. So basically, Thomas Jefferson is one of 25 people. The DNA study did not show that Thomas Jefferson was the father. That was not possible with that study. It just
Mhm.
showed that Y haplotype is inherited by a Jefferson male. Well, there were 25 Jefferson males. So that really proves nothing towards his paternity. It
All
just
right.
makes him one of the 25, right? I
Yeah, it
mean,
says
that's
this
how I
this
would see it.
demonstrates that Eston's father was a Jefferson male. Fine,
Yes,
that's
that's
right.
all
We
that
all agree with that.
shows.
But how does this? It not only corroborates Madison's account. Madison says Jefferson was my father. How does this corroborate that? Now he doesn't say, that Eston was fathered by someone with the Jefferson Y chromosome. Couldn't say that at the time, but he doesn't say Jefferson was fathered by someone in the Jefferson bloodline. He says Thomas Jefferson was my father and my sibling's father. It's a very specific account. So how does it corroborate his testimony? It doesn't.
Not at all. Not at all. Not even remotely close.
Right? It definitively refutes the claims by Jefferson grandchildren, including Ellen and her brother, that either Peter or Samuel Carr was the father of Sally Hemings' children. Well, maybe he wasn't the father. One of those was not the father of Sally Hemings' children, all of them, but maybe he was the father of at least one.
Like Madison
There's
or
a lot
somebody
of
else.
buzz
Harriet.
that, I'm sorry,
Like Madison or Harriet or somebody else could have been. Who knows?
yeah,
It's
we
you
don't
can't
have,
definitively
it's hard to
say.
get in touch with Harriet and the other female. But it's interesting to note that there's some discussion of Madison Hemings himself being fathered by Peter Carr. And we do know that, I looked at census records, and Madison Hemings was 5'7". Eston Hemings was 6'1.5", more just tall, like Thomas Jefferson. And we do have evidence that verbal evidence that Thomas Jefferson knew that Eston Hemings looked a lot like Thomas did, but that could be very easily explained if Randolph was the father. He could have looked like Randolph. Randolph could have looked like Thomas. Brothers look alike, and
Which I
the
would
point
presume he
is we
did.
want. These people are claiming it's factual. There's nothing here that shows factuality.
Well, look at the next one, number 3. Let me read this one. Madison Hemings was described by a U.S. Census taker as the son of Thomas Jefferson in 1870. That tells you nothing. Only that
Yeah.
a census taker said that. That means nothing. I mean, man, that'd be like me saying that somebody I work with is the father of some other person, and I'm just saying it. There's no proof behind that.
Yeah, notice it's not saying he was described in a U.S. census, but by a U.S. census
Why?
taker, a taker, someone who gives out census, is responsible. Um, yeah, Israel Gillette Jefferson, formerly enslaved at Monticello, corroborated. I love to use they use these terms that have precise meaning and meanings in science, so like confirmation, corroborate, which means to provide additional inductive evidence. We have all this evidence. This is more evidence. Corroborate Madison's claims in the same newspaper, referring to Sally Hemings as Thomas Jefferson's concubine. Well, as we showed a couple of weeks ago, all Israel Gillette, who took the name Jefferson on around 1840, showed is that he stated, well, everything I have to say is really drawn from Madison's account. And what Madison says, I really believe. So how does that
Right.
corroborate?
He's my friend. I believe him.
Well,
Not
you want to do
evidence.
the fifth?
Yeah. So number 5 is Eston Hemings changed his racial identity to white and his surname to Jefferson after moving from Ohio to Wisconsin in 1852. Newspaper accounts in Chillicothe, Ohio in 1887 and 1902 recalled that Eston resembled Thomas Jefferson.
Comments?
Again, they're just the newspaper accounts saying that he looked like him. Like you said, you pointed out he could have looked like him because he could have been his brother or another relative's, who looked like Jefferson. Presumably, they had some looking alike. And changing his racial identity to white just meant that he could probably pass for that, which would have given him more privileges in society and maybe given him the right to vote or given him easier time getting work. So that doesn't prove anything. That just
Yeah, and look at when the accounts were 1887, and Jefferson died in 1826. So
we're
that's
talking
60 years after his death, at least. And then we have 75 years after his death, or 76 years. We have
In
newspaper accounts
1902.
well after, decades after Thomas Jefferson died, said, I did a show with an artist friend of mine who I'll have to get back on the show. We looked at all the paintings and reproduction depictions of Jefferson in statuary, in paintings and drawings. And I asked the question, what did Jefferson really look like? Well, he probably had a long neck, even though my artist friends that drawing people with a long neck was something that people did at the time in art. And we saw he probably had a lazy eye, by the way. I look at a lot of the pictures, one of the eyes in the paintings, it always seems to be, less pronounced than the other. He might have had a lazy eye and a lot of different things, you can conclude, but there were stark differences in many of the paintings.
Yes. Yes. Thomas Sully compared to Rembrandt Peale. Those
Right.
paintings are vastly different depictions of how
Yeah.
he looked.
Sully's painting, I just thought it's sort of disfigured too because the body is so long and the head is smaller than it should be. And then Sully was a brilliant painter when he wanted to be.
He was.
That painting, it's very earthy colors, the reds, the deep browns, and some
Yeah, I believe that's the
light.
one that's at West Point.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So I mean, what is this? What are we supposed to get from that? I don't know. That was what, number six. Let's go down
It was
to
that was number five, I think.
five.
Yeah,
That
number
was five.
six, yeah, is the next one.
All right, go ahead.
Um, the two oldest surviving children of Sally Hemings, Beverly Hemings, a male, and Harriet Hemings, were both allowed to leave Monticello without pursuit and were described as "quote unquote" runaway in Jefferson's inventory of enslaved families. In an 1858 letter to her husband, Joseph Coolidge, Jefferson's granddaughter, Ellen Wales Randolph Coolidge, while denying Jefferson's paternity, described Sally Hemings' children as, quote, all fair and all set free at my grandfather's death, or had been suffered to absent themselves permanently before he died, unquote.
Well, that sort of shows that the Hemings people had special status at Monticello, and there is the long-standing rumor, which is probably true, that Sally Hemings was the stepsister of Jefferson's wife, right?
Yeah, the daughter of her father, right? John Wales.
Yes, and if we assume that that's true, and I think it probably is from my research into it, um, it explains why the Hemings had a special status. They would have been special and close to Martha Wales skeleton. So they would have had a special status at Monticello. There is no evidence when you look at the account books of Jefferson that Thomas Jefferson ever felt especially attached to Sally Hemings. He shows no, that to me is telling. I went through every reference I could find in the account books of Sally Hemings. There's nothing that shows. I mean, if he's madly in love with this gal, her name's going to be popping up. Even if not in obvious ways, he's going to be saying stuff like, well, gee, she's really great with Mary Jefferson. I'm really proud and happy to have her, in Monticello, attending to her chores. He doesn't say any of that. And
Because that's part of human nature. People do that.
yes, and then Freud has this wonderful quote. He says, if someone's lips are silent, betrayal forces it with the eyes or the hand, something. People betray. You know that from criminal cases. Is that
All the time. All the
yeah?
time. And I think when you examine this, that it's just there's no doubt they had a special status. Nobody, I think, is really denying that. It's the reason why Monticello's trying to paint it that he was the father, absolutely, with all their flimsy quote unquote evidence. But in reality, it was most likely because she was Martha's sister, half sister.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes more sense. Um,
Yeah. I so there's nothing really um, nothing really compelling in this scrap, this ort of evidence. I have my cat getting in the way of my screen here.
you can see the
Bingo.
tail.
Number 7 we're on.
Yes.
Jefferson's records of his travels and the birthdays of Sally Hemings' children reveal that he was President Monticello during the estimated dates of conception for all 6 Hemings' documented offspring. Statistical model shows the likelihood of this coincidence for any other male as 1% or 1 chance in 100 strong evidence of. Yeah, this is the most interesting argument that they give. The first part is
Yeah.
that Jefferson was was at Monticello roughly at the times that he would have needed to be for Sally Hemings to have gotten pregnant when she got pregnant for when the children were birthed. If you work backwards 9 months or so, whatever it is, it's interesting. What is not stated there, George? I mean, what do we know about Sally?
We don't know where she was. I mean, it's presumed she was at Monticello, but she could have been loaned out to another plantation. She could have been not there. And I think it's also presuming that when he would come to Monticello, other Jefferson relatives, his brother, his cousins, his nephews, would come to visit. He was the patriarch of the family. So
You know,
we don't know where
and we do
she's
have
at.
evidence of Randolph someone talking about Randolph always hanging around. One of the slaves mentioning Randolph's um, always hanging around the slaves and singing and dancing to all night, all hours of the night.
Playing the fiddle.
Yes, and that puts him at the scene of the crime. Now, so we know it's a necessary condition if Jefferson was the father that the two had to be together
Yes.
9 months prior. So we have Jefferson at Monticello, but we don't know where Sally Hemings was. Can we presume she was there? I guess you could, but that's not good enough for honest scholarship.
No, it's
Honest
not. And it's not,
scholarship.
and it's not at all.
No, I mean, we just have to say, we can presume she was there, but we don't know. So there's this black cloud. They don't do that. Then they talk about statistical modeling. Fraser Neiman, who's the director of archaeologists, publishes this paper, which I've talked about in my book on Jefferson, Framing a Legend. By the way, my book, Framing a Legend, if you go look at the resources that they have for books on this, they have William Hyland's book on Against Paternity. They have Robert Turner's book listed, but they have none of my two books. In fact, being the most prolific Jefferson scholar in world history, 30 books, 29 of which are published, there is no mention of any of my books at Monticello. It's like I don't exist for them. Someone needs to call up
right?
Jane Kamensky. And why is that? Why is a book on the Natural Bridge on the banned books list? Why is a book on Jefferson morality? Why is a book on the disease of liberty? The letters of the one I just sent you, the letters exchanged between Jefferson and his brother, letters between Jefferson and Maria Cosby. These are all on the banned books list, by the way, as if I'm sort of satanic figure because I happen to very viscerally and cogently, in my estimation, I disagree with them. My arguments are very compelling. There was very likely no relationship between the two. Now, this argument he comes up, he uses Bayesian modeling to come up with this extraordinarily, it's incomprehensible to most people to understand the mathematics behind it. I studied Bayes in the philosophy department at the University of Pittsburgh. When we were studying inductive reasoning, we studied Bayes. I'm not a Bayesian, but it's a mathematical formula that allows us, if we start off with certain prior probabilities of Jefferson being the father, and then we add evidence to it, we can reassess the probability. And he comes up with this argument that there's only a 1 in 100 chance of Jefferson not being the father. Now, how do you come up with that? I followed the argument. You come up with that by putting in evidence that gives you that and excluding evidence that argues against it. Any kind of mathematical formula is only as good as the evidence that you use.
That's what's put into it.
It's a bullshit argument. It's a real bullshit argument. And Monticello, I mean, if the argument is true, if it really is, according to the math here, that there's only a 1 in 100 chance that Jefferson did not father all 6, this would be the feature argument for them. It settles it. We don't have to even talk about this. They don't feature it that way because if they did, other mathematicians would destroy it. All right, so the statistical modeling amounts to nothing. I talk about this in my Framing a Legend. I talk about this.
Which is a great book.
Yeah. You want to read the number 8?
Number 8. Oral tradition connecting the Hemings and Jefferson families was transmitted among the descendants of both Madison Hemings and Eston Hemings over many generations. Madison Hemings calls Jefferson his quote-unquote father in his 1873 recollections, a fact repeated by his descendants. Eston Hemings' descendants altered their family history to state that they were related to one of Thomas Jefferson's relatives in order to hide Eston Hemings' decision to change his racial identity when he moved to Wisconsin.
Any comments on
So,
this? I don't know how much you
yeah,
know about this.
I mean, there again, we're using this oral history, right? And if you're going to use any kind of oral history or anecdotes from history that are orally transmitted, and you want to use them as evidence, like I would do if I was investigating something, they would have to be connected to something else, right? I mean, they're not considered fact or proof of anything unless they are connected to something that is provable, right? They could add to that if you had something, but in and of themselves, it's just people talking. It's just an oral history. It doesn't mean it's not valuable, but in and of itself, it proves nothing. It proves, again, it doesn't prove anything. And I just think that they have to emphasize that because they have so little actual evidence.
Yeah. Of course, he's going to call Jefferson his father in 1873. It begs the question, why doesn't he come clean on this earlier? No one else in the family came clean on this. Why didn't anybody in the family note that? Being a descendant, being fathered by Jefferson would be a sort of golden ticket in Ohio, in
You would think.
Chillicothe. So why didn't he come clean with this earlier? It begs the question, did Samuel Wentworth, who was the editor of Pike County Republican, concoct this story and pay Madison? He was no friend of the Republicans of Jefferson State, pay Madison handsomely or decently to come up with this story, which was corroborated by Israel, right, months later. I love the way they use that. And of course, if Eston comes clean and he agrees that he's going to be the father in 1783, then he's going to keep the story going. It probably gives him a certain level of prestige in Ohio, being descendant of
Absolutely.
Thomas Jefferson, and he's going to tell that story for generations. It's not strange. Now, Thomas Jefferson's relatives, in order to hide Eston's decision to change his racial identity, what he moved. So he claims, in some sense, that he doesn't want to talk about being related to Thomas Jefferson because that would show that he has a black mother, though a white father. So, so they changed their name. They altered their name. That doesn't show anything. All right, we
Yeah.
got two more here. You want to walk
Number
us through?
9. Jefferson freed all 4 surviving Hemings children in accordance with the terms of his negotiation with Sally Hemings, as reported by her son Madison, and he did not grant freedom to any other enslaved nuclear family.
All
Again,
right, so he did free the 4 Hemings children in accordance with terms of. Notice what's in the parentheses. In accordance with the terms of his negotiation with Sally Hemings. Sally was 14 when she got there. When were these negotiations about which Madison talks about, occurred? When did they occur? Apparently, she comes up and she says something to the effect, well, I realized that, if there's no slavery in Paris and I can stay here and be a free person. So she sits there with one of the brightest intellects in the world at the time. Come on. And she's negotiating with him. She's
14-year-old
probably
girl.
not literate, but she's going to be bright enough, even though she's got the IQ of a pencil eraser. If we follow, I exaggerate there, but she's probably not a very bright person. Very, very handsome, very comely, but not very bright. But she's going to come up with the idea of negotiating with Jefferson. So you're going to tell me that she has any negotiative powers or skills, or that staying behind by herself at 16 years old, by the time when they left, is an appealing option for her? Didn't mention staying with her brother.
I could find that very hard to believe.
A 16-year-old who's behaving like a 10-year-old probably is going to negotiate and is going to find the option of staying behind as a free person in France, away from all of her relatives, appealing. That's ridiculous.
And that makes no sense. And then the last line where they said he did not grant freedom to any other enslaved nuclear family. Although true, but what they also don't mention is that his estate was in massive debt at the time of his death. The slaves were considered property at the time, and there was no way to just free all of them without paying for those debts. And that
Yeah,
hence
you had to.
Monticello
I
had to
mean,
be sold.
the people to whom he owed money at the time were demanding that they sell the estate, that they sell the slaves so that they can pay off. And Jefferson owned today roughly about over $1 million in debt, and you know, he just couldn't grant freedom to all the slaves.
And that's just a
The
fact. And
people
but the
to
way
whom
they
he
paint
owed the
it
money
here,
demanded that they be sold so that some of the money can go toward
and
paying
of
the
course
debt.
they slant it here to make it seem like that is evidence of him privileging them more when they completely ignore the economic argument, like you said, of the massive debt that he had. It's
Yeah,
pretty unbelievable.
let's do the last one. You can read that through, and we'll,
This is a
if you
good
want
one
to
here. Let's
offer
see.
some comments.
The names of Sally Hemings' four surviving children, William Beverly Hemings, Harriet Hemings, James Madison Hemings, and Thomas Eston Hemings, suggest family ties to Thomas Jefferson. Annette Gordon Reed outlines these naming connections in her book, Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, An American Controversy. A man named William Beverly accompanied Jefferson's father on an expedition through Virginia in 1746, and he was connected to the Jefferson's mother's family by blood and marriage. There were multiple Harriets in the Randolph family, including a sister and a niece of Thomas Mann Randolph, Jefferson's son-in-law. Madison Hemings was named at the request of Dolly Madison, whose husband, James Madison, was one of Jefferson's closest friends. Historian biographer Fawn Brodie offered two possible explanations for Eston Hemings' name. Eston was the birthplace of Jefferson's maternal ancestor, William Randolph in Yorkshire, England. Thomas Eston Randolph was also a first cousin of Jefferson. Jefferson described their two families as being almost as one. Furthermore, it was convention for Jefferson to be involved in the naming of family members. His children with Martha Jefferson were given the names of his sisters and mother, and he personally named each of his grandchildren.
So what
There's a
do we
lot
get
there,
from
but
this?
I mean, it was not uncommon during those times for children of slaves to be named after their masters or members of the family. Those were very common names at the time. The fact, like when they refer here that one of them was named Thomas Eston Randolph. Well, if another member of Jefferson's family had that name, maybe they asked Sally to name the child Eston. There's no evidence that Jefferson himself did that, whatsoever. And they're relying on Annette Gordon Reed's book and Fawn Brodie's, which is all supposition and no evidence is provided. Like the one
Yeah,
about Dolly Madison, I find that just hard to believe that Dolly Madison would
that's
insist on.
ridiculous. That she's sitting there and she sees the baby. Oh, it's such a beautiful baby. You have to name it after my husband. Why? Why would she be so concerned that the child of a slave be named after her husband?
I
And she
don't think she
begged.
would.
And like you said, it was common for slaves to assume the names of prominent people in the family, especially if you're from an
Absolutely.
important family like the Hemings. Look what
Yes.
Israel Gillette did right around 1840. He changed his name to Israel Gillette Jefferson. Why? Well, he wanted to let everybody know that he was a former slave of Thomas Jefferson.
Yes. That was a
And
very common thing.
it was commonly done. Um, all right. I mean, so we have the qualifiers removed. There's some comments here, some footnotes about Bayes' theorem number 2. And yeah, notice all the evidence here. Fawn Brodie, Annette Gordon Reed, Bayes' theorem. There's never anywhere any sort of push to get at arguments against their view. None of these arguments individually is compelling, right? None of these 10 arguments, not one of them, you sit back and say, like I said, if the Bayes argument was so compelling, it would just end debate on both sides. But if you
It'd be
go
scientifically
through,
factual. It'd be the end
yeah,
of
if
it.
you go through meticulously all the evidence put in the evidence that was ignored, you don't get this
No.
99% probability that Jefferson fathered all the kids. None of these arguments individually shows anything. All of them together show nothing as well. You can't add very inconsequential arguments together to get a consequential argument. Inductive arguments, when they're poorly supported, are assessed individually. They're all poorly supported arguments. Together, they give you 10 poorly supported arguments that essay to show. And what Monticello always does with this is they use what I call the consilience argument. William Whewell was a philosopher, talked about consilience of inductions. you've got all these things coming together like little streams forming a massive river. And when you have so many things coming together, Monticello keeps saying is that we have all these strands of evidence pointing in this direction, nothing pointing against it, which is crap, because there are four, as I've showed in my book, four firsthand testimonies that cause problems for their argument. They never give them. They give them all short shrift. Zero arguments of direct testimony for the relationship. So it's really pathetically badly done. President Jane Kaminsky owes us, I'm going to stop sharing this, she owes us some explanation for why there's not open discussion on this issue, which clearly is not closed at all. In fact, the wealth of evidence shows Thomas Jefferson probably had no involvement with Sally Hemings.
Take for example your books. You were talking about it earlier that your books, which I've read, Framing the Legend. I also read Mr. Hyland's book and Robert Turner's, but your book especially, and all the books you have written. If their arguments are so strong, they shouldn't be afraid. As Jefferson say, using reason free to combat error. They shouldn't be afraid of that. They should have your books there. But the bottom line is, because they are propping up this economic engine of Monticello, which is worth a lot of money, and they get paid a lot of money, and also for whatever progressive, postmodernist views they might have, that's kind of a double-edged sword. I think they promote that, and they don't want an alternative opinion. They don't want your book there. They don't want any of your books there, because they are very logically written, and they absolutely destroy. The Framing the Legend destroys their arguments, and I think that they just don't want to hear your dissenting opinion.
Yeah, and I'm not out there to, as a lot of people think, we have a few minutes left before we go, but I'm not out there to exonerate Thomas Jefferson come what may. That's not what I do. It's not what we do on this show.
No.
We're just there to give an honest and fair assessment of the evidence. And as a philosopher and someone who studied logic and taught logic, it bothered me considerably when you cherry pick. You only look at evidence for the case that you're making, and you refuse to look at evidence that is damning of the view. You can't do that. You can't do that when you. So they owe us. Jane Kaminsky, who's the president, owes us some discussion of why they haven't reviewed this and revised their notion, why they're not having open discussion. You have any final words? You're going to tell us what we're going to do next week? We have to do, maybe in a couple of weeks, Madison Hemings.
We'll have to do that. Next week we're going to review your newest book on the correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and his brother Randolph. That's going to be next week's show, which I'm really looking forward. It's the one you mailed me. I'm really looking forward to reading it, and I'm looking forward to the discussion next week.
Yeah, it's. I'll talk about this, but why do I write books sometimes? Sometimes I write books because the extant literature out there is slanted in a particular direction, and I think it's giving us a false picture of say the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Randolph Jefferson, his brother. Surprisingly, there are people who've written books on Jefferson who didn't know he had a brother. Fuck that. Astonishing. All right, as usual, right. You did a great job. I want to thank you for your input on this, and we're going to see you guys in another week. TTFN.
All right, TTFN. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.